Hello and welcome to Restitution, Returning Colonial Loot. I'm Lewis McNaught. Last month, a delegation from the Maasai community of Kenya and Tanzania decided that a small number of Maasai ornaments, almost certainly removed forcibly from their owners during the colonial era, should remain in the collection of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. The decision wasn't taken lightly, and it wasn't taken quickly either. It followed 6 years of sensitive research and collaboration between Maasai representatives visiting the museum and Pitt Rivers' own curatorial staff. Retention, rather than repatriation in this case, is the result of a project launched by the museum called Living Cultures. So I'm delighted that joining us on the podcast today is Dr. Laura van Broekhoven, Director of the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford. A very, very warm welcome, Laura, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to start with, can you tell us more about the Living Cultures project? It sounds such an interesting project, and I'm really curious to know why the museum launched it, and perhaps, above all, what it hopes to get from it.
Right, yeah, so the museum, the project really was launched together with this Maasai community activist called Samuel Nangiria. He came as part of this sort of Indigenous leadership program, which was organized by an NGO called Inside Share in 2017. And together with lots of other Indigenous leaders from Mexico and from India, and then he was the one from Tanzania, they came and we had agreed that we would sort of bring out some objects from storage from those different communities. So he came and he reacted very strongly to the objects. So there was no sort of like, we're going to set up a project, etc. But it was more sort of almost like just something that we agreed with the NGO, thinking, okay, if you're bringing over all these Indigenous leaders, let's take the opportunity for them to be able to engage with collections. And so one of our team had selected a number of objects quite sort of arbitrarily, who were all in storage. And Sam sort of immediately said, I don't understand, why are you using certain words? Why would some of these objects, I don't understand how they would have, why are they here? So you sort of asked a very crucial question, like, why is this object here? These are not things we would do away with ever. I don't understand why these objects would be here, and I don't understand why you're using certain words. Like, for example, it says here that they were collected. What does that mean? Because so he asked all these sort of semantic questions, but also provenance questions. And he said, I'm going to go back to the elders in Loliondo, which is the place that he's from. And I'm going to ask them what they want to do about this, because some of these objects, he said, are still probably affecting very negatively the communities that they came from, because this would be sort of like through the lineages, children will be stillborn, cows will be dying. So this is actually still causing a lot of harm, the fact that these objects were taken. So I said, okay, well, and we, a couple of months later came a film of Sam, who'd been sort of trained as in participatory video making. They have a sort of video making community who are video makers, and they made this really good video actually of this sort of 4 Maasai men and 4 Maasai women in conversation with Sam and saying how annoyed they were that these objects were in the collections, that they didn't know about those objects being in the collections, and that they wanted to engage with the administration of the museum and look for ways forward. So I sent the video back, and then that's kind of how the project started. I sent the video back inviting them to come to the museum, and they sent a delegation the next year, so that was in 2018, of 5 delegates of the Maasai who'd been selected for their knowledge, sort of knowledge keepers from Tanzania and from different parts of Tanzania and Kenya, because the Maasai, obviously, they live across those sort of current borders. So the project really wasn't a project to start with. It was a meeting, and then, but it very much sort of came as part of an approach that I'd been doing quite a lot of in the past, and the museum also had done a lot of working with Indigenous communities. And so I think that's why it fitted quite well with the sort of work that we do, listening to communities, looking at them on equitable footing, so that we're really sort of seeing, okay, what these communities know about these objects is actually as important as what we know about these objects.
Well, let's
But
talk
that
about
really,
those. Let's talk about their knowledge
yes,
base, because
yeah,
they made the decision here. This is what's so fascinating about this whole
exactly.
event. They made the decision. So, what was it about these objects? Why that they decided they should remain in Oxford? They can remain in Oxford. They'll be well looked after in Oxford. What is it that drove their decision?
Yeah, so what happened is that so the first delegation that came to identify which objects were problematic, because they said actually, we want to see what you have. So there were five delegates who came, and they looked at 180 of the objects that we have, because we have about 188 objects, and with very specific ones, only 5 of them they said, these are really problematic. These are objects of inheritance, objects that we would never do away with. If you do away with them, it leads to all those, horrible things that sort of for many generations to come, both for those who are taking the objects and for those who are doing away with the object, this leads to trouble. And so that was, and then they said, but we need spiritual guidance to know what to do, knowing that you have these objects here. So they went back, had lots of conversations there, lots of disagreement also actually among the Maasai, some people saying we need to bring in lawyers, we need to sue the university, they need to come back. But then the spiritual leader actually was the one who then sort of had the ultimate word, saying, actually no, this needs to be a peaceful process. Our people have suffered enough. It needs to be a process of peace, and we're going to go into further conversations. And he was the one who was sort of guiding the process alongside the more political leadership base of the Maasai. They said actually a spiritual leader with the sacred Enkidong, which is a calabash that they use in their epistemology, in their way of knowing. Mm-hmm. This calabash is filled with little stones of different colors, and so the chief Laibon Mokombo, he's too old to travel, so he's in his 80s, but he sent his son, and it's a hereditary position in the Maasai. So his son came with this sacred calabash that had never left Kenya, and seated here actually in my office on the floor. We were all seated around these 5 objects, and he sort of throwing little stones and counting the little stones in little sort of bundles of 10, and then taking some away. He sort of identified what he felt needed to happen, but also the history of the objects. Who were they taken from? Because from the historical sources, it looked like they weren't taken like on the battlefield, or they weren't, it's not like with the Benin bronzes, for example, where we know that they were, for most of them, we know when they were looted, how they were looted. We have pictures of the loot and more loot, but that's not the case for these objects. So we don't have really good provenance in our historical documentation. The Laibon, however, was able to identify, okay, this is how they were taken, these families, is that who they belong to, these sections. And then there was a lot of work that needed to be done by the Maasai to go to a sort of pilgrimage to the families once they had been identified, to sort of see, okay, we need to go tell them, because when an object like this has been taken, it's almost like as if it's a dead ancestor that is lying somewhere. So for the families, this was really painful. And so they needed to go with the Laibon, tell them that their mother or father, as they call them, had been found, and then discuss what the ways forward were again. So this was in 2020, just before COVID, that they sort of had identified the objects. They knew which families they were from. In 2021, they did the pilgrimage, and Mokombo by that time had told us that for him, if we were willing to commit to the process, there needed to be the Elata Oingiro ceremony needed to be done.
And what is that?
The Elata Oingiro ceremony is a ceremony that the Maasai do to re-establish relationship when a Maasai has been killed. Mokombo had said, if we do the Elata Oingiro ceremony, that will be able to re-establish, bring peace to the families who the objects were taken from, and healing for the museum also, and the families who were involved in the taking. They asked us to identify the families who were involved in the taking, but because we don't have really good provenance research, and also, even though we did look for families, it looked like most of the people who were involved in the taking that we could identify didn't have sort of a lineage, because they didn't have children or people would have died. Which to the Maasai sort of said, yeah, well, see, that's because these objects bring, sort of bad luck. So to them that seemed very logical. So the Selato Ingiro ceremony meant that we had to go and visit the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, which we did last summer. So not this summer, but the summer before in 2023. We had to bring the appropriate gift that you bring as part of the ceremony is 49 cows per family. So that was 245 cows that needed to be bought. Once I sort of heard that, I did, and Mokombo had said, if Laura needs to say whether she can commit to this process, and I did think, I don't know, I'm going to fundraise.
How do you go out and find 245 cows just like that?
I know, yeah, and it's funny because it's quite expensive. But luckily, the Staples Trust actually also trusted the process, and they wanted to continue with the process, so they agreed to fund the sort of this gift that we needed to bring, and so we did. In the end, so last summer or 2023, we went there. And I must say what happened just far exceeded our expectations. We hadn't thought that it was going to be thousands of Maasai who came to these ceremonies. Obviously, these are quite unique ceremonies because, people don't kill each other all the time. So it's not that there's just constantly Relato Ingero ceremonies. In the beginning, we would be brought into the village or the sacred site where the ceremony had to happen. Those had been blessed before we came. The cows were then also brought there. We slept there also, and then we were welcomed into the town by hundreds of people singing and dancing and sort of welcoming us. A new fire was established. Shoes made out of leather of cows were made for us because we had to herd the cows over a river. That's part of the process, and then hand over to the family. So I had never heard of a cow before, so I was a little bit concerned that I might lose the cows, but I didn't, because there was luckily people who knew what they were doing there who were helping us. But so it was a whole process of sort of a ceremonial process really to go through with the handover of the cows, and then there was a sitting down. Once the cows had been herded and handed over to the families, we sat down with the families and spoke about their memories of when this object was taken, their hopes for the future, and mostly sort of wishing each other peace. So when the British took over colonial rule, there was a political organization which was called the Orkiama, of all the leaders of the 25 sections. And what Mokombo had said, so the chief Laibon had said, the spiritual leader had said that if this is really going to lead to healing for my people, the Orkiama needs to be re-established. And as part of these ceremonies, they set up the Orkiama again, which hadn't met since 1919 when the British abolished the Orkiama because they weren't allowed to meet anymore. So now this Orkiama has been set up again. With one change is that they used to be just male leaders of the Orkiama, but actually because all these objects were made by women, and cultural knowledge obviously sits mostly with women, both language and the way of making and using sits with women, and several of the objects were for female ceremonies. They decided that actually the Orkiama needed to not just be composed out of male leaders, but also female leaders. So now the Orkiama has 50 leaders. It's been set up again, this whole transnational, because it's from Kenyan and Tanzanian leaders who've come together, and they're the ones who are now deciding what are the next steps. And so what they decided that as a next step to decide what needed to happen with the objects, so not so much with the families anymore only, but with the objects, we needed to bring the family members here, which we did. So they were here a couple of weeks ago to bless the objects, to decide what needed to happen with the objects, whether they needed to return or not. And we'd always said, whatever needs to happen, we'll try to make it happen. Obviously, It's not in the museum's gift or my gift to decide whether an object goes back, because they are the property of the university. So it would need to go through our procedures and be decided by council. But in the end, and a bit to our surprise, the families actually, having seen the object, which was a really difficult moment, and we did film it, and we will put a film together which will go on our website. But they really found it very hard to see the objects, because to them it was like this body of their ancestor being there, and it was very much linked to all the difficult things that they had to experience since the objects were taken. But luckily, the Laibon had actually said, there's these 2 roots of plants, herbal teas need to be made, which actually are going to calm everyone down. So it was a very difficult moment. We actually thought they were going to ask for the objects to be returned to the families. But after several days of working with our team and sort of looking at how we were taking care of the objects and considering, for them, sort of the main reason, there were a couple of reasons why they felt actually the objects should stay here. And so, like the last day actually of meetings before we did a public ceremony, we sat around the table and we said, so what would you like to see happening with the objects? Because we had several moments where people were with the objects and talking about them, feeling all kinds of sort of emotional feelings. And they said, we have decided that they should stay here because we feel that they're being well taken care of. And for us, it's a bit like when a Maasai warrior dies on the battlefield. We don't collect the Maasai warrior. We bury him on the battlefield. So they were making this sort of, and then we go to the place as almost like a bit like the sort of Commonwealth cemeteries. So for them, it was very much like with the Commonwealth, that these objects were, they were well taken care of. They told us to put their names and to sort of make sure that they're all in boxes separate from each other, but held sort of in the same place. So we were given guidance of how to take care of the objects. But otherwise, they said, actually, we want them to stay here because our process is a process of peace, relationship building, and we want them to be here as representatives of what has happened in sort of healing and reconciliation and the work that we've done, which has been a work of peace.
And
so
was there anything you did which you think made them feel particularly comfortable to leave them there? Was there something that you contributed to Pitt Rivers to make them feel at ease?
Yeah, I think it's the way that we've made the project not about us, but more about sort of healing and making the project about not so much a bureaucratic process, but one where we're really building that relationship and building the trust and listening. I think that was really important for us to listen, to see where can we support, to take the time also, because sometimes it was half a year we wouldn't hear anything. And I think that's also where the funding, obviously not being sort of either academic funding or which would usually come with very specific deadlines that you need to keep to. But actually this super understanding and committed donor also made a huge change, huge amount of created the possibility to do the work that we did. I think also the going into the process with an open mind and saying we're going to actually listen, we're going to take this seriously, we're not going to just say, well, it's repatriation or nothing. But and I think that also was really important in the process.
So there are going to be a lot of benefits going forward with the Maasai community.
Yes.
Do you think, it sounds as if you are almost giving them the power to decide whether or not the objects should stay in the museum?
Yeah, I think that is, so if you've worked for so long with each other, at least for them to decide whether they want to put in a claim. In the end, we always have to tell people we don't decide because it's the university that is the owner. So the process of the university, these are the procedures. What we try to do is we try to work hand in hand with those that are putting in claims. So that, we have all the documentation. Sometimes, claims will be made and they come with, this bunch of paper, but lots of it is done by lawyers, but none of it actually helps us to make the decision for the university. So we would still not have the documentation that we need. They've spent a lot of money, but actually the papers that we need are not there. So that's also where we're really changing the way that we're approaching the whole idea of claims, where we're working with the community and seeing, okay, sometimes we'll have to say we don't think that this is going to pass our eligibility criteria. If this is the way that you're formulating your claim, this is not going to be, for our procedures, that doesn't work. But often it's really about sort of looking at, okay, why are the reasons? What would you like to see happening? So it's really about going into a conversation instead of this adversarial, sort of almost like we're at war with each other. Exactly. And we have to defend this because otherwise we're going to lose it. Actually saying, okay, what can we do together? Because we're both in this together. These are objects that have meaning only when we know from those that know the meaning what they're about. And so I think, being part of a university museum also means that we want to generate new knowledge, generate understanding, be able to teach, be able to share, and build relationships and partnerships. And I think that's what we're really trying to do.
And I suppose finally, what are the lessons for other museums to learn from this experience, which has been really quite profound and inspirational as well, by the way? So what would you say to other museums who may be facing similar problems?
Yeah, so I think in really sort of taking it one step at a time, trying to find ways forward alongside each other is really important. Lots of museums have small amounts of staff. I think that's where it's so hard sometimes to have to do this work without the time, the money, often not even the resources to sort of have your databases in order. And I think that's where, if we can support each other to both, I think, help with, sort of setting up policies, working with the government alongside each other, trying to see how can we build networks. And I think that's sort of where I'd say for us, this is such a process of friendship building, relationship building, new knowledge building, that to have to shut the door on it is such a shame. And beautifully, actually, sort of at this time when Sam came, I had reached out to the British Museum also to sort of see whether they would be happy, because they have a much bigger Maasai collection, whether they could facilitate a visit. We've also worked with the Ornament and with Cambridge and with Liverpool, so we've sort of tried to make sure that other museums are also brought into this network and that the Maasai can engage with them also. And it was a beautiful meetings with the British Museum where I think the next stage is actually looking at can similar sort of work happen in other collections in the UK. So I'm quite excited about the possibilities.
Well, there's a lot that others can learn from your experience, which you've shared. It's inspirational as well as exciting. So thanks for joining me on the podcast today, Laura. It's been great fun. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
We normally conduct the restitution debate through the lens of repatriation. But this Pitt Rivers experience, as Laura likes to call it, proves that repatriation is not the only solution to how culturally sensitive objects can be maintained. Their experience demonstrates the value of keeping an open mind, building deeper friendships and relationships with source communities. There's so much that we can all learn from that. That's it. See you in the next episode.